In the dim light of dawn in lofts across Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, Taiwan, and a dozen other countries, a ritual takes place. It happens in silence, behind closed doors, with drawn curtains. The fancier, the pigeon keeper, moves with practiced efficiency. A small bottle, a dropper, one eye, then the other. The bird blinks, shakes its head slightly, and within seconds the liquid has traveled down the tear duct, into the throat, absorbed into the bloodstream. 24 hours later, that same pigeon will be released 800 kilometers from home. It will fly for 12 hours straight, navigating magnetic fields, reading the sun's position, processing visual landmarks at speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour. When it lands exhausted, disoriented, wings trembling, it will have placed in the top 10, perhaps even first. The owner will collect the prize money, perhaps several $1,000s, perhaps tens of thousands if the race was significant enough. The pigeon, now a proven champion, will have its value multiplied. Offspring from this bird will sell for astronomical sums. A lineage is established. A dynasty begins. But here's what the camera doesn't show, what the racing results never mention, what the auction catalogs carefully omit: that pigeon's immune system is compromised. Its bones are weakening. Its adrenal glands have begun to atrophy. In 6 months, it will be dead or so damaged that it will never fly competitively again. This is not speculation. This is not rumor. This is documented, researched, scientifically verified reality. And yet it continues, race after race, season after season, in every major pigeon racing country in the world. Welcome to the world of pigeon racing doping, a practice so widespread that researchers call it an open secret, so systemic that even the regulatory bodies struggle to contain it, and so technically sophisticated that it has created an entire underground pharmaceutical economy. This is the story of what really happens before the race. This is the story of the forbidden ritual. Before we can understand the doping, we must understand the stakes. Pigeon racing is not, as many assume, a quaint hobby for elderly gentlemen in rural villages. It is a multi-billion-dollar global industry, with sophisticated breeding programs, international competitions, professional training facilities, and prize pools that rival those of horse racing. In Belgium alone, there are approximately 20,000 registered pigeon fanciers. In China, where the sport exploded after the lifting of restrictions in the early 2000s, previously it had been condemned as bourgeois decadence, the number reaches into the hundreds of thousands. Taiwan, Japan, South Africa, Portugal, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, Australia, in all these countries, pigeon racing is a federated sport with governing bodies, official rules, sanctioned competitions, and anti-doping programs. The first official pigeon race was held in Belgium in 1818. Since then, Belgium has established itself as the global epicenter of pigeon breeding and racing. The phrase Belgian pigeon carries the same weight in pigeon racing circles as Kentucky thoroughbred does in horse racing. The bloodlines are meticulously documented. The genetics are studied with scientific rigor. The training programs are sophisticated and complex. A champion racing pigeon can sell for hundreds of thousands of dollars. In 2019, a pigeon named Armando sold at auction for $1.4 million. In 2020, a bird named New Kim sold for $1.9 million to a Chinese buyer. These are not outliers. They represent the upper end of a market where 5-figure and 6-figure transactions are routine for birds with proven racing records or desirable genetic lineages. The races themselves are extraordinary feats of navigation and endurance. Birds are transported in specially designed vehicles to release points ranging from 60 kilometers to 1,200 kilometers from their home lofts. The release is synchronized. The birds launch into the air in massive flocks, sometimes thousands at once, and immediately begin orienting themselves toward home. What happens next is still not fully understood by science. The birds use a combination of magnetic field detection, solar navigation, landmark recognition, and olfactory mapping to find their way home. They fly at altitudes between 200 and 500 meters, adjusting for wind conditions, avoiding predators, navigating around obstacles. The fastest birds maintain average speeds of 80 to 100 kilometers per hour. Those speeds can exceed 130 kilometers per hour with favorable winds. Upon arrival at their home loft, the bird lands on a landing board equipped with an electronic scanning system. A microchip embedded in a leg band is read automatically, recording the precise moment of arrival. The time is calculated, the distance is known, the velocity is computed, the rankings are generated. The bird that arrives first, or more precisely, the bird that achieves the highest velocity relative to distance, wins. Prize money is distributed, reputations are enhanced, breeding opportunities multiply, and the cycle begins again. This is the visible face of pigeon racing, the tradition, the skill, the dedication, the marvel of avian navigation, the celebration of a relationship between human and bird that spans millennia. But beneath this visible surface lies another reality. The Belgian problem. Belgium's dominance in pigeon racing is not just a matter of tradition or expertise. It is a matter of genetics. During World War II, German occupation forces systematically confiscated pigeons throughout occupied territories. Pigeons had been used extensively for military communication in World War I, and the Germans wanted to prevent their use by resistance movements. In the Netherlands, the confiscation was nearly total. By 1945, the Dutch pigeon population had been decimated. In Belgium, the confiscation was extensive but not complete. Some fanciers managed to hide their best birds. When the war ended, these surviving Belgian bloodlines became the foundation for rebuilding pigeon racing throughout Europe. This created a genetic bottleneck that paradoxically worked in Belgium's favor. The surviving birds represented the cream of pre-war breeding, the fastest, strongest, most intelligent birds that fanciers had chosen to hide and protect at great personal risk. Post-war breeding programs built on this foundation produced extraordinary results. By the 1960s and 1970s, Belgian pigeons were dominating international competitions. Fanciers from other countries traveled to Belgium to purchase breeding stock. A thriving export market developed. Belgian fanciers became celebrities within the pigeon racing world. Fortunes were made. But then in the 1980s and 1990s, something changed. Certain Belgian lofts began producing results that seemed almost miraculous. Birds that had performed moderately well early in the season would suddenly, in August or September, begin flying with extraordinary speed and endurance. Week after week, these birds would place in the top rankings. Their velocities would exceed anything seen before. Their consistency was uncanny. Other fanciers noticed, questions were asked, rumors began to circulate, and then gradually the secret emerged. Corticosteroids. The cortisone revolution. Cortisone, more properly, corticosteroids are hormones naturally produced by the adrenal glands. In the body, they serve numerous functions. They regulate metabolism, suppress inflammation, modulate immune responses, and influence mood and energy levels. In medical contexts, synthetic corticosteroids are used to treat inflammatory conditions, autoimmune diseases, allergies, and various other ailments. They are powerful drugs with significant benefits and equally significant side effects when used improperly or for extended periods. In the late 20th century, some Belgian fanciers discovered that corticosteroids had remarkable effects on racing pigeons. The effects were multiple and synergistic. First, corticosteroids suppress the body's inflammatory response. When a pigeon flies 800 kilometers, its muscles accumulate damage. Micro tears occur in muscle fibers. Lactic acid builds up. Inflammation develops. Normally, this inflammation causes soreness and fatigue. The bird needs time to recover, but with corticosteroids on board, the inflammatory response is blunted. The bird doesn't feel the soreness. It continues flying at high speed even when its muscles are damaged. Second, corticosteroids affect energy metabolism. They promote the breakdown of proteins and fats to generate glucose. This provides the bird with sustained energy during long flights. The bird can maintain high-intensity effort for longer periods without experiencing the energy depletion that normally limits endurance. Third, and perhaps most significantly, corticosteroids are mood-altering drugs. They create a sense of well-being, even euphoria. Veterinarians who have worked with corticosteroid-treated pigeons describe them as tireless, happy to fly for extended periods, and highly responsive to motivation. Young pigeons treated with corticosteroids are observed flying around their lofts for hours, seemingly without fatigue, eager and enthusiastic. For competitive pigeon racing, this combination of effects is extraordinarily valuable. The bird flies faster because it doesn't feel pain. It flies longer because its energy metabolism is enhanced. And it flies with enthusiasm because its neurochemistry has been altered to suppress fatigue signals and enhance motivation. The results were dramatic. Lofts using corticosteroids began dominating competitions. The Belgian racing scene was revolutionized, and inevitably the practice spread to the Netherlands, to Germany, to Portugal, to England, and eventually to pigeon racing communities worldwide. But there was a problem, actually several problems. What cortisone really does. To understand why corticosteroid doping is not just unethical, but genuinely harmful, we need to understand how these drugs actually work in the pigeon's body and what happens when that body is subjected to them repeatedly over time. The adrenal glands sit just in front of the kidneys. They are small, unassuming structures, but they play a crucial role in the body's stress response system. When an animal, any animal, including humans and birds, encounters a stressor, the hypothalamus in the brain releases a hormone called corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH. This signals the pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, which in turn signals the adrenal glands to produce cortisol and other corticosteroids. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, and it's one of the body's fundamental regulatory systems. It governs the response to stress. but it also regulates normal circadian rhythms, immune function, digestive processes, mood, and energy levels. The system operates on a feedback loop. When corticosteroid levels in the blood rise, the hypothalamus and pituitary sense this and reduce their signaling to the adrenal glands. When corticosteroid levels fall, the hypothalamus and pituitary increase their signaling. In this way, the body maintains corticosteroid levels within a healthy range. Now imagine what happens when you introduce synthetic corticosteroids from an external source. Initially, the body responds as if there's been a stressful event that caused the adrenal glands to release a large amount of natural cortisol. The hypothalamus and pituitary detect the elevated corticosteroid levels and reduce their signaling. So far, this is normal. But if the synthetic corticosteroids continue to be administered day after day, week after week, the body's feedback system begins to adapt to the new reality. The hypothalamus and pituitary progressively reduce their output of CRH and ACTH. The adrenal glands receiving less stimulation gradually reduce their production of natural corticosteroids. Over time, they may even begin to atrophy, to shrink and lose function. This is called hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis suppression, or HPA suppression, and it is one of the most serious complications of long-term corticosteroid use. In a racing pigeon receiving regular doses of synthetic corticosteroids, the natural corticosteroid production system essentially shuts down. The bird becomes dependent on the external supply. If that supply is suddenly discontinued, the bird enters a state of adrenal insufficiency. Its body can no longer produce the corticosteroids necessary for normal function. The bird becomes lethargic, loses appetite, may experience digestive problems, and in severe cases may go into shock. But HPA suppression is only the beginning of the problems. Skeletal damage. Corticosteroids interfere with calcium metabolism and bone formation. This is a well-documented effect in humans. Long-term corticosteroid use causes osteoporosis, increasing the risk of fractures. The same process occurs in birds, but with even more serious consequences because birds' skeletal systems are highly specialized for flight. Bird bones are hollow and pneumatized, filled with air extensions from the respiratory system. This makes them extremely light relative to their strength, which is crucial for flight, but it also makes them vulnerable to disruptions in the bone-forming process. Corticosteroids disrupt this process in multiple ways. They inhibit the activity of osteoblasts, the cells that build bone tissue. They promote the activity of osteoclasts, the cells that break down bone tissue. They interfere with calcium absorption in the gut, and they increase calcium excretion by the kidneys. The result is progressive bone weakening. The bones become less dense, more brittle, more prone to fracture. In a bird whose entire existence depends on the structural integrity of its skeleton, this is catastrophic. Young birds are especially vulnerable. A pigeon's skeleton is not fully mature until approximately 6 months of age. During this critical growth period, proper bone formation is essential. If corticosteroids are administered during this time, as they sometimes are, in an attempt to develop early maturing racers, the effects can be permanent. Birds treated with corticosteroids during the growth phase develop abnormal skeletal structure. The bones are thinner, weaker, improperly mineralized. The bird may reach normal size, but its skeleton lacks the strength of a healthy bird. These birds are more prone to injuries during training and racing. They may suffer stress fractures during intense flight, and they age prematurely, losing flight capability earlier than normal birds. Veterinarians can sometimes identify corticosteroid-treated birds by radiographic examination. The bones show characteristic changes: decreased density, thinner cortices, abnormal trabecular structure. But by the time these changes are visible on X-rays, the damage is already significant and largely irreversible. Growth stunting and metabolic disruption. Beyond their effects on specific systems, corticosteroids have broad impacts on growth and metabolism. They interfere with protein synthesis, promote protein breakdown, alter glucose metabolism, and disrupt normal hormonal patterns. In growing birds, this results in stunted development. The bird may grow to normal size, but its muscle mass is reduced. Its organ development is impaired, and its overall physiological capacity is diminished. These birds look normal but lack the physical reserves of healthy birds. They fatigue more easily, recover more slowly, and have less tolerance for environmental stressors. The metabolic disruptions are particularly problematic because racing pigeons are already operating at the limits of their physiological capacity. A race of 800 kilometers represents an extraordinary metabolic challenge. The bird must sustain high-intensity aerobic activity for 8 to 12 hours or more. This requires efficient energy utilization, proper thermoregulation, effective waste removal, and coordinated function of multiple organ systems. Corticosteroids disrupt all of these processes. The bird may initially appear to perform better, flying with more enthusiasm, showing less fatigue, but this apparent improvement comes at a profound metabolic cost. The bird is essentially burning through its physical reserves at an unsustainable rate, suppressing the normal feedback signals that would cause it to rest and recover. After such a flight, the bird's recovery is prolonged and incomplete. Muscle damage accumulates, energy stores are depleted, the immune system is further compromised, and the bird becomes increasingly vulnerable to the next challenge. The sudden death syndrome. One of the most disturbing phenomena reported by veterinarians and fanciers is what might be called sudden death syndrome in corticosteroid-treated birds. A bird that appears perfectly healthy, eating normally, flying well, showing no obvious signs of illness, suddenly dies. Sometimes this happens during a race, sometimes it happens during training, sometimes it happens at rest in the loft. Post-mortem examination often reveals underlying disease that was progressing silently. Advanced respiratory infection, liver damage, kidney failure, heart abnormalities. The corticosteroids had suppressed the inflammatory response and masked the symptoms until the disease was so advanced that sudden decompensation occurred. This is the ultimate expression of what corticosteroids do to racing pigeons. They create an illusion of health and performance while the bird's body is actually failing. They allow the bird to perform beyond its natural capacity, but only by overriding the safety mechanisms that normally prevent self-destructive levels of exertion. It is quite literally the pharmacological equivalent of cutting the brake lines in a car and declaring that the vehicle now goes faster. The ethical abyss, when we consider all these effects together, the immune suppression, the bone damage, the metabolic disruption, the shortened lifespan, the progressive deterioration masked by apparent performance enhancement, we arrive at an inescapable conclusion. Corticosteroid doping is not just cheating. It is not merely an unfair competitive advantage. It is systematic, deliberate, pharmacologically induced harm to the animal. The bird cannot consent. It cannot understand what is being done to it. It experiences the euphoria and reduced pain perception without any awareness that its body is being damaged. It flies with enthusiasm because its neurochemistry has been artificially altered, not because it is genuinely healthy and capable. This is where the ethical abyss opens. Because unlike human athletes who dope themselves, making an informed, if unwise choice to accept the risks for potential rewards, the racing pigeon has no choice. It is subjected to these drugs by its owner. For the owner's benefit, regardless of the cost to the bird's health and well-being, the bird suffers, the bird's life is shortened, the bird's quality of life is degraded, all so that the owner can win prize money and enhance the bird's breeding value. This is not sport. This is animal abuse dressed in the language of competition. And yet it continues. Not occasionally, not as rare aberration, but systematically, routinely, across multiple countries year after year. Which brings us to the question, how do they get away with it? Part 3, the detection problem. Why pigeons are the perfect target for doping. If you wanted to design an animal that would be almost impossible to test effectively for performance-enhancing drugs, you could hardly do better than a racing pigeon. First, consider the fundamental challenge of sample collection. In horse racing, blood samples are routinely collected from race winners. A horse has a large jugular vein that is easily accessible. A trained veterinarian can collect 20 to 30 milliliters of blood in a matter of seconds with minimal stress to the animal. The sample volume is more than adequate for comprehensive testing using multiple analytical methods. In dog racing, similar procedures are used. Dogs are large enough that blood collection is straightforward. Urine samples can also be collected easily. But a racing pigeon weighs 400 to 600 grams. Its largest accessible vein, the basilic vein in the wing, is smaller than a strand of angel hair pasta. Collecting even 1 to 2 milliliters of blood requires expertise and carries genuine risk to the bird. Collecting the 10 to 20 milliliters that would be needed for comprehensive drug testing would be dangerous and potentially fatal. Moreover, pigeons do not urinate in the conventional sense. Unlike mammals, birds excrete both urine and feces together through the cloaca. The white part of bird droppings is uric acid, the avian equivalent of urine, but it is mixed with fecal material and cannot be separated for independent analysis. This leaves one primary option for drug testing in pigeons: fecal analysis. The fecal matrix problem. Feces are an extraordinarily complex biological matrix. They contain partially digested food, digestive enzymes, bacteria, trillions of them, bacterial metabolites, bile acids, mucus, sloughed intestinal cells, and trace amounts of various substances excreted by the body. Detecting drugs in this mixture is like looking for a specific grain of sand on a beach. But it's actually worse than that because unlike sand grains, the drug molecules you're looking for are chemically reactive, may be bound to other compounds, may have been metabolized into different forms, and are present in minuscule concentrations. Modern analytical methods, particularly liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry (LCMS), are remarkably sensitive and can detect drugs at nanogram per gram levels. But even these sophisticated techniques face challenges when the sample matrix is as complex as bird feces. First, the drugs must be extracted from the fecal material. This typically involves multiple steps: drying the sample, grinding it to powder, mixing it with solvents to dissolve the drugs, filtering out solid material, concentrating the extract, and further purifying it using solid phase extraction or other methods. Each step risks losing some of the drug molecules. Recovery rates. The percentage of the drug that is successfully extracted and available for analysis rarely exceed 80% and are often much lower. Second, the extracted sample must be analyzed using chromatography and mass spectrometry. The chromatography separates different compounds based on their chemical properties. The mass spectrometry identifies and quantifies each compound based on its molecular weight and fragmentation pattern. This produces a complex data set that must be interpreted by trained analysts. The interpretation is not always straightforward. Some substances can occur naturally in pigeons or can enter the body through contaminated feed. Some substances are metabolized into forms that are chemically similar to natural compounds. Some substances are present at levels so low that they approach the detection limits of the equipment. This creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is the enemy of enforcement. The threshold problem. In human and horse doping control, certain substances are classified as endogenous, meaning they occur naturally in the body. Testosterone, for example, is produced naturally by the body, but can also be administered as a performance-enhancing drug. For such substances, anti-doping programs establish thresholds, levels above which a sample is considered positive for doping. If an athlete or horse tests above the threshold, it is presumed that exogenous external substance was administered. Setting these thresholds requires extensive research. Researchers must analyze hundreds or thousands of samples from untreated individuals to establish the normal range of variation. Statistical methods are used to determine a threshold that minimizes both false positives, incorrectly identifying a clean sample as doped, and false negatives, incorrectly identifying a doped sample as clean. For racing pigeons, this research has largely not been done. Corticosteroids are naturally produced by pigeons' adrenal glands. The levels vary based on time of day, season, stress level, reproductive status, and individual variation. Some pigeons naturally produce more corticosteroids than others. Some dietary components can influence corticosteroid metabolism. Without comprehensive data on normal variation, setting a threshold is guesswork. Set it too low and you get false positives, innocent birds flagged as doped, simply because they naturally produce higher levels of corticosteroids. Set it too high and you get false negatives, actually doped birds that pass under the threshold. In Belgium, the most advanced pigeon racing nation in terms of anti-doping efforts, thresholds have been established for some substances. But these thresholds are kept confidential, ostensibly to prevent fanciers from calibrating their doping regimens to stay just below the threshold, but with the practical effect of eliminating transparency and making it impossible for independent researchers to evaluate the validity of the thresholds. Other pigeon racing federations have not established thresholds at all. Some have simply banned corticosteroids entirely. Any detectable amount is considered a violation. But this creates its own problems, because trace amounts of corticosteroids can enter a bird's system through contaminated feed, through contact with medication intended for other animals, or through environmental contamination. The timing problem, the pharmacokinetics of drugs in pigeons, how quickly they are absorbed, distributed, metabolized, and excreted, are poorly understood for most substances. There are very few controlled studies. Most of what is known comes from extrapolation from other bird species or from anecdotal observations. This lack of data creates opportunities for strategic timing. Consider the typical timeline of a race. Birds are transported to the release point, often on Thursday or Friday. Birds spend Thursday night and Friday night in race baskets at the release point. Birds are released Saturday morning. Birds fly home, arriving Saturday afternoon or evening. Birds must remain in their lofts for at least 5 days after the race for potential testing. Now consider the pharmacokinetics of prednisolone, one of the most commonly used corticosteroids. Studies in other bird species suggest that prednisolone is metabolized relatively quickly. In the single published study on prednisolone detection in pigeon feces, the drug was detectable for approximately 2 days after administration. So a fancier administering prednisolone on Thursday afternoon, just before the birds are transported to the race, knows that the drug will be present during Friday and Saturday, providing its performance-enhancing effects during the race, but will be largely metabolized and excreted by Sunday or Monday, 2 to 3 days before any testing might occur. The bird flies the race under the influence of the drug, but by the time samples are collected, the drug is gone. For some drugs, the detection window is even shorter. Clenbuterol, a bronchodilator that enhances oxygen delivery and may have anabolic effects, has been detected in pigeon feces for only about 24 hours after administration. Other drugs have longer detection windows. Boldenone, an anabolic steroid, can be detected for up to 7 weeks. But boldenone also requires longer-term administration to produce effects. It's not a drug you give the day before a race. It's a drug you give during training, then discontinue well before the race. Sophisticated dopers understand these pharmacokinetics. They know which drugs to use when. They know how to stage their administration to maximize performance enhancement while minimizing detection risk. The basket contamination defense. One of the most insidious aspects of pigeon racing is the race basket. Birds from different lofts are transported together in large baskets, essentially mobile lofts with compartments for individual birds or small groups. The birds spend 1 or 2 nights in these baskets before release. During this time, they eat, drink, and defecate in close proximity. Some birds may regurgitate feed. All of this creates opportunities for cross-contamination. Now imagine this scenario. A fancier administers corticosteroids to his birds. One of those birds ends up in a basket compartment adjacent to a clean bird from a different loft. The doped bird regurgitates some feed. This is not uncommon, especially if birds are stressed by transport. The clean bird, seeing feed, eats it. The clean bird now has corticosteroids in its system. Not as much as the doped bird, but enough to potentially trigger a positive test. When the clean bird tests positive, its owner has a ready defense. Basket contamination. My bird must have eaten regurgitated feed from a doped bird. I didn't administer any drugs. This defense is plausible. It has happened. It probably does happen with some regularity in races where doping is prevalent. But it's also the perfect cover story for actual doping. An owner who intentionally dopes his bird can claim basket contamination if caught. And without proof of intent, without witnesses to the actual administration, without documentation of the drug source, without pattern evidence from multiple tests, it's nearly impossible to definitively prove that the positive test resulted from intentional doping rather than inadvertent contamination. This ambiguity undermines the entire testing program. Even when tests detect drugs, even when violations are confirmed by laboratory analysis, the perpetrators can often avoid consequences by invoking basket contamination. The economic constraints. Drug testing is expensive. A comprehensive LC-MS analysis can cost several $100s per sample. Multiply this by the number of birds that would need to be tested in a large race, potentially hundreds, and the costs become prohibitive. Most pigeon racing federations operate on limited budgets. They are funded by membership fees and race entry fees, not by government grants or corporate sponsorships. Spending tens of thousands of dollars on drug testing would consume resources needed for other purposes. Maintaining timing systems, ensuring events, supporting clubs, maintaining facilities. As a result, testing is limited. In Belgium, which has one of the most active anti-doping programs, only a tiny fraction of race birds are tested. Random sampling is used, occasionally supplemented by targeted testing of suspiciously good performances. But the vast majority of birds are never tested. This creates a perverse incentive structure. The risk of being caught is low, the potential rewards of doping are high. Even fanciers with ethical qualms may rationalize that everyone else is doing it, and that competing clean puts them at an unfair disadvantage. The situation resembles cycling before comprehensive anti-doping efforts were implemented, a sport where doping was so prevalent that it had become normalized, where clean competitors were disadvantaged, where the institutional response was inadequate to the scale of the problem. The laboratory capacity problem. Even when samples are collected, they must be analyzed by laboratories with appropriate equipment and expertise. Not many laboratories meet these criteria. In human anti-doping, there is a global network of World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA-accredited laboratories. These labs meet strict standards for equipment, quality control, staff training, and reporting. They participate in proficiency testing programs. They are subject to regular inspections. They operate within an internationally harmonized framework. No equivalent system exists for animal sports doping. There is no international accrediting body for pigeon doping control laboratories. There are no standardized proficiency testing programs. There is no harmonized framework for methods, thresholds, or reporting. Some pigeon racing federations send samples to horse racing laboratories. These labs have excellent equipment and experienced staff, but they may not have specific expertise in avian pharmacology or in the unique challenges of analyzing pigeon fecal samples. Other federations use veterinary diagnostic laboratories. These labs may have expertise in avian medicine, but may lack the sophisticated analytical equipment needed for trace-level drug detection. Still, other federations have no laboratory arrangements at all. They collect samples but have nowhere to send them for analysis. The samples sit in freezers, never tested, serving primarily as a psychological deterrent. a bluff that works only as long as fanciers believe the samples might eventually be analyzed. This lack of laboratory infrastructure means that even when testing is attempted, the results may be unreliable, methods may not be properly validated, quality control may be inadequate, results may not be defensible in any subsequent legal proceedings. The legal and regulatory complexity. Pigeon racing exists in a regulatory gray zone. It is not governed by the same animal welfare laws that apply to commercial animal use or scientific research. It is not subject to the same drug regulations that apply to food-producing animals or to veterinary medicine more broadly. In most countries, pigeon racing is regulated primarily by private organizations, the national federations and their constituent clubs. These organizations establish rules, conduct competitions, and handle violations. They are not government agencies. They have no statutory authority. Their power derives entirely from membership agreements. This means that enforcement mechanisms are limited. If a fancier is found guilty of doping, the federation can impose penalties, suspension from competition, forfeiture of prizes, perhaps permanent ban from membership. But these are essentially contractual remedies. The federation cannot impose criminal penalties. It cannot seize assets. It cannot compel testimony. If a fancier decides to simply leave the federation and compete in unsanctioned events, or to race under a different identity, or to have a friend or family member register as the nominal owner of birds, there is little the federation can do about it. Moreover, the legal standards for establishing violations are unclear. In some jurisdictions, proving intent is required. In others, strict liability applies. The owner is responsible regardless of how the drug entered the bird's system. In still others, the legal framework is undefined, and disputes must be resolved through federation internal procedures that may lack transparency or due process protections. This legal uncertainty further undermines enforcement. Fanciers caught doping may challenge the results, claim improper procedures, or threaten litigation. Federations, often operating with limited legal resources, may choose to settle or reduce penalties rather than engage in protracted disputes. The geographic arbitrage problem. Pigeon racing is international, but regulation is national or even local. Different countries have different rules. Different federations have different testing programs. Different labs use different methods and thresholds. This creates opportunities for geographic arbitrage, choosing to compete in jurisdictions with lax enforcement. A fancier in one country might transport birds to another country for competition, selecting events where testing is less rigorous or where penalties are less severe. Or a fancier might simply race in informal or unsanctioned competitions that have no testing at all. The International Pigeon Racing Federation, Fédération Colombophile Internationale, FCI, has limited authority to harmonize rules or enforce standards. It is essentially a coordinating body for national federations, not a regulatory authority with enforcement power. This fragmentation means that even when one jurisdiction implements strict anti-doping measures, the problem simply migrates to other jurisdictions. The most aggressive dopers gravitate toward the weakest enforcement environments, and the whole system tends toward the lowest common denominator. The knowledge deficit, perhaps the most fundamental problem in pigeon racing doping control, is simply the lack of scientific knowledge about what these drugs actually do in pigeons. To the best of available knowledge, there are no published controlled studies examining the effects of corticosteroids on racing performance in pigeons. There are no studies examining optimal dosing regimens. There are no studies examining long-term health effects. What exists instead is anecdotal observation and confidential comments from pigeon fanciers and veterinarians, to quote the Belgian research paper on the subject. This is an astonishing state of affairs. It means that the entire practice of pigeon doping, both by those who dope and by those who try to detect and prevent doping, is based on informal experimentation and word-of-mouth knowledge transmission. Fanciers trying to dope their birds experiment with different drugs, different doses, different timing protocols. They observe the effects, they share information selectively with trusted associates. They refine their methods, but there is no systematic documentation, no controlled comparison, no scientific rigor. Anti-doping officials trying to detect doping must work with equally limited information. They don't know with certainty which drugs produce performance enhancement. They don't know optimal detection methods. They don't know appropriate thresholds. They are essentially trying to solve a scientific problem without scientific data. This knowledge deficit serves the interests of dopers. Ambiguity favors those who want to circumvent rules. As long as the science remains undeveloped, as long as the pharmacology remains poorly understood, as long as the detection methods remain imperfect, doping will continue because the risk-reward calculation favors it. Part 4. The drugs they use. The corticosteroid core. We've discussed corticosteroids extensively, but it's worth detailing the specific drugs most commonly used in pigeon racing. Prednisolone is perhaps the most prevalent. It is widely available in veterinary formulations, relatively inexpensive and effective when administered orally or via eye drops. It has a moderate duration of action, long enough to provide effects during a race, short enough that it is largely metabolized before testing occurs. Betamethasone is favored by some fanciers because it is highly potent milligram for milligram. It produces stronger effects than prednisolone. This means smaller doses can be used, potentially reducing the risk of detection while still achieving performance enhancement. Bugenide is used less commonly, but has the advantage of being a corticosteroid with relatively targeted effects. In humans, it is used for asthma and inflammatory bowel disease because it acts locally in the lungs or gut with less systemic absorption. Some fanciers believe this reduces side effects while maintaining performance benefits, though there is no evidence supporting this belief in pigeons. Dexamethasone is the most potent of the commonly available corticosteroids. It is long-acting and produces profound effects. It is sometimes used in training to enhance conditioning, then discontinued well before competition to allow for metabolism and excretion. All of these drugs share common mechanisms and common risks. They differ in potency, duration of action, and pharmacokinetics, but they all suppress inflammation, enhance energy metabolism, alter mood, and carry the risks of immune suppression, bone damage, and HPA axis disruption. Beta agonists, the bronchodilator connection. After corticosteroids, beta-adrenergic agonists are probably the most commonly abused drugs in pigeon racing. Clenbuterol is the primary example. Originally developed as a bronchodilator for treating asthma in humans and respiratory disease in horses and livestock, clenbuterol has found widespread use as a performance enhancer in multiple species. In the lungs, clenbuterol activates beta-2 adrenergic receptors on smooth muscle cells, causing the airways to dilate. This increases airflow, improves oxygen delivery, and reduces the work of breathing. For a pigeon flying 800 kilometers, improved respiratory efficiency translates directly to performance enhancement. But clenbuterol has effects beyond the respiratory system. It also has anabolic properties. It promotes muscle growth and reduces muscle breakdown. Studies in livestock have shown that clenbuterol increases muscle mass and decreases fat mass. Similar effects likely occur in birds, though again, controlled studies are lacking. The combination of improved respiratory function and enhanced muscle development makes clenbuterol highly attractive for racing pigeon doping. The drug can be administered orally, is relatively inexpensive, and is readily available through online pharmaceutical suppliers. The detection problem with clenbuterol is significant. It is metabolized relatively quickly, with a detection window in pigeon feces of only about 24 hours. A fancier who administers clenbuterol on Friday evening, just before transport to the race, can be confident that the drug will be active during Saturday's race, but largely undetectable by Sunday. Other beta agonists occasionally reported in pigeon doping include salbutamol, albuterol in U.S. terminology, terbutaline, and formoterol. All are respiratory drugs with bronchodilator effects. All can theoretically enhance racing performance. None have been systematically studied in pigeons. Anabolic steroids, the muscle-building gambit. Anabolic androgenic steroids, AAS, synthetic derivatives of testosterone, are best known for their use by human athletes and bodybuilders to increase muscle mass and strength. They've also been used in horse racing and other animal sports. In pigeon racing, anabolic steroids are less prevalent than corticosteroids or beta agonists, but they are used particularly in training rather than immediately before races. Boldenone, also known as equipoise, is the most commonly cited anabolic steroid in pigeon racing. Originally developed for veterinary use in horses, boldenone promotes muscle growth and increases red blood cell production. The latter effect improves oxygen carrying capacity, which could theoretically enhance endurance in racing pigeons. Boldenone has a long detection window. Studies show it can be detected in pigeon feces for up to 7 weeks after administration. This makes it risky to use close to competition. Instead, fanciers reportedly use boldenone during training, building muscle mass and increasing red blood cell count, then discontinue it well before racing season to allow for clearance. Other anabolic steroids occasionally reported include nandrolone and stanozol. All carry risks similar to those in other species: liver damage, reproductive system disruption, behavioral changes, and cardiovascular effects. The evidence that anabolic steroids actually improve racing performance in pigeons is thin. The drugs certainly alter physiology. They increase muscle mass, affect red blood cell production, alter metabolism, but whether these changes translate to faster race times is unclear. The flight muscles of pigeons are already highly developed and optimized for endurance flight. Whether further muscle hypertrophy improves or impairs flight efficiency is an open question. Nevertheless, the belief that anabolic steroids enhance performance persists, and some fanciers use them, adding another layer to the pharmacological manipulation of racing pigeons. Stimulants. The amphetamine question. Stimulant drugs, substances that increase alertness, reduce fatigue, and enhance motivation, would seem to have obvious applications in racing pigeon doping. And indeed, there are reports of stimulant use, though less commonly than corticosteroids or beta agonists. Amphetamines and methylphenidate Ritalin are occasionally mentioned in discussions of pigeon doping. These drugs increase dopamine and norepinephrine signaling in the brain, producing wakefulness, focus, and reduced perception of fatigue. The challenge with stimulants is dosing. Birds are small, and the margin between an effective dose and a toxic dose is narrow. Too little and there's no effect. Too much and the bird becomes hyperactive, anxious, potentially unable to navigate properly. Moreover, the effects of stimulants on navigation are unclear. Racing pigeons rely on sophisticated cognitive processes to find their way home, processing magnetic field information, integrating visual landmarks, making strategic decisions about flight path. Would a stimulant-induced state of arousal enhance or impair these processes? There's no evidence either way. Some reports mention cocaine use in racing pigeons. In 2013, samples from Belgian racing pigeons tested by a South African laboratory returned positive results for cocaine. The findings made headlines, but the circumstances remain murky. Was the cocaine intentionally administered as a performance enhancer? Was it environmental contamination? Was it laboratory error? No conclusive answers emerged. The pharmacology of cocaine in birds is poorly understood. Cocaine is a stimulant and local anesthetic. In humans, it produces euphoria, increased energy, and reduced fatigue. It also has cardiovascular effects, increased heart rate and blood pressure, that could be dangerous in a bird undergoing the extreme cardiovascular demands of a long-distance race. Most experts believe that if cocaine was present in those Belgian pigeons, it was likely accidental contamination rather than intentional doping. But the incident illustrates the breadth of substances that might potentially appear in pigeon testing and the difficulty of interpreting positive results. Pain medications, the NSAID strategy. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, are common pain and inflammation medications. In humans, this category includes aspirin, ibuprofen, and naproxen. In veterinary medicine, drugs like carprofen, meloxicam, and ketoprofen are used. NSAIDs work by inhibiting cyclooxygenase enzymes, which are involved in the production of prostaglandins, chemical mediators of inflammation and pain. By blocking prostaglandin production, NSAIDs reduce pain, decrease inflammation, and lower fever. For a racing pigeon, NSAIDs could theoretically provide similar benefits to corticosteroids, reducing the pain and inflammation associated with intense muscular exertion without some of the serious side effects of corticosteroids like immune suppression and bone damage. The Belgian doping scandal of 2013 involved Mobistix, a human drug containing piroxicam and NSAID. 5 pigeon samples tested positive for this substance. The testing was controversial. The original Belgian laboratory reported negative results, but when samples were retested in South Africa, positives were found, raising questions about testing methodology and inter-laboratory variation. NSAIDs are not without risks. In birds, they can cause gastrointestinal ulceration, kidney damage, and bleeding disorders. The safety margin in pigeons is uncertain because pharmacological studies are lacking, but compared to the profound risks of corticosteroids, NSAIDs might represent a lesser evil in the doping pharmacopeia. A fancier seeking performance enhancement with reduced risk to the bird's long-term health might choose an NSAID over a corticosteroid. Of course, this calculation misses the point. The choice is not between more harmful and less harmful doping. The choice is between doping and not doping, between respecting the bird's physiological integrity and manipulating it for competitive advantage. Opioids, the endurance paradox. Opioid drugs, medications related to opium, including morphine, codeine, fentanyl, and synthetic derivatives, are powerful pain relievers that work by activating opioid receptors in the nervous system. There are sporadic reports of opioid use in pigeon racing, though it seems uncommon compared to other drug classes. The rationale would be pain relief during long flights, allowing the bird to maintain high speed despite muscular fatigue. The problem with opioids is that they don't just relieve pain, they also cause sedation, respiratory depression, and disruption of normal physiological reflexes. A pigeon under the influence of opioids might feel less pain, but it would also be less alert, less responsive, potentially less capable of the complex navigational and flight control tasks required in racing. Moreover, opioids are highly addictive in mammals, and while addiction mechanisms in birds are poorly understood, there's no reason to believe birds would be immune to dependency with repeated use. The risk-benefit calculation for opioid doping seems unfavorable. The potential benefits are modest, the risks are significant, and the detection methods are well established. Opioids have been tested for in animal sports for decades. Nevertheless, the fact that opioids appear at all in discussions of pigeon racing doping speaks to the breadth of pharmacological experimentation that some fanciers are willing to pursue. Erythropoietin. The EPO question. Erythropoietin. EPO is a hormone that stimulates red blood cell production. It became infamous in human sports in the 1990s and 2000s when cyclists and other endurance athletes used synthetic EPO to increase their red blood cell counts. thereby improving oxygen carrying capacity and endurance. In theory, EPO could benefit racing pigeons through the same mechanism. Flight is intensely aerobic. Oxygen delivery to muscles is a key limiting factor in endurance. Increasing red blood cell counts should improve oxygen delivery and enhance performance. In practice, EPO use in pigeons faces several obstacles. First, administering EPO requires injection. It cannot be given orally. Injecting a pigeon requires skill and carries risk. Second, EPO takes weeks to produce significant effects. It's not a drug you give before a race. It's a drug you administer during a training period. Third, elevated red blood cell counts carry their own risks. Blood viscosity increases, potentially straining the cardiovascular system and increasing the risk of thrombosis, blood clots. There are no confirmed reports of EPO use in racing pigeons, but the drug is mentioned in theoretical discussions of potential performance enhancers, and it's possible that some fanciers have experimented with it. Detection of EPO is technically challenging. The molecule is a protein hormone that is difficult to distinguish from endogenous naturally produced EPO. Human sports anti-doping programs use indirect methods, looking at markers of abnormal red blood cell production, or direct methods involving sophisticated antibody-based assays. These methods have not been adapted to pigeon testing. Caffeine and ephedrine, the accessible stimulants. Caffeine and ephedrine are stimulant drugs that are widely available. Caffeine in coffee, tea, and energy drinks. Ephedrine in certain over-the-counter cold medications, though its availability has been restricted in many jurisdictions due to its use in illegal methamphetamine production. Both drugs increase alertness, reduce fatigue, and enhance physical performance in humans. Both have been used as doping agents in human and animal sports. For pigeon racing, caffeine or ephedrine could theoretically be administered in drinking water in the hours before transport to a race. The drugs would be absorbed, producing stimulant effects during the flight. The problem, as with other stimulants, is dosing and uncertain effects on navigation. Additionally, both caffeine and ephedrine have cardiovascular effects, increased heart rate and blood pressure, that could be problematic during the extreme exertion of a long race. There are occasional anecdotal reports of fanciers giving pigeons coffee or tea before races, presumably for the caffeine content. Whether this practice actually provides any performance benefit is unknown. What is known is that caffeine metabolism in birds differs from that in mammals, and the optimal dose, if any, and the risk-benefit profile are undefined. The polypharmacy problem, perhaps more concerning than any single drug, is the practice of polypharmacy, using multiple drugs simultaneously. Some fanciers reportedly administer multiple substances in combination: a corticosteroid for anti-inflammatory effects, a beta agonist for respiratory enhancement, perhaps an NSAID for additional pain relief, perhaps a stimulant for alertness. This practice compounds the risks. Each drug has its own side effects. Drug combinations can produce interactions. One drug may enhance or inhibit the effects of another. The overall burden on the bird's metabolism increases. The likelihood of adverse effects increases. And there is absolutely no research on the effects of drug combinations in pigeons. Every combination is an uncontrolled experiment performed on living animals without any understanding of the consequences. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of pigeon racing doping. Not just that it happens, but that it happens with complete disregard for the animal's welfare, with no scientific basis, guided only by informal experimentation and the desire for competitive advantage. Belgium, the epicenter. Belgium remains the heart of pigeon racing, and therefore the heart of the doping problem. The Royal Belgian Pigeon Fancier Federation, Koninklijke Belgische Dievenliefhebbersbond, Royal Fédération Colombophile Belge, abbreviated KBDB RFEB, governs the sport in Belgium. With approximately 20,000 members and thousands of races per year, it is the largest and most influential pigeon racing organization in the world. The KBDB RFEB has implemented one of the most sophisticated anti-doping programs in pigeon racing. The organization employs a scientific advisory commission that advises on testing methods and thresholds. It has established relationships with analytical laboratories. It conducts random testing and targeted testing of suspicious performances. But even this relatively robust system faces limitations. Only a small fraction of birds are tested. The testing occurs days after races, allowing short-acting drugs to clear. The thresholds are confidential and may not be scientifically validated, and the legal framework for enforcement is limited. The result is that doping persists in Belgian pigeon racing despite anti-doping efforts. The 2013 scandal, when retesting of supposedly clean samples revealed multiple positives, demonstrated that doping was more prevalent than official testing suggested. Belgian veterinarians who work with racing pigeons report that corticosteroid use is widespread. Some describe it as an open secret, not openly discussed but widely understood to be happening. Some estimate that a significant percentage of top-performing birds have been given corticosteroids at some point. The economic incentives in Belgian pigeon racing are particularly strong. Champion birds sell for enormous sums, breeding rights are lucrative, prize money is substantial, and the cultural prestige of success in pigeon racing in a country where the sport has deep historical roots adds non-financial motivations. All of this creates an environment where doping pressure is intense, where the benefits of doping are high, and where the risks of being caught are relatively low. The Netherlands, the neighbor's dilemma. The Netherlands, with its strong pigeon racing tradition and close geographic and cultural ties to Belgium, faces similar challenges. Dutch pigeon racing is organized through numerous local clubs coordinated by provincial and national federations. The system is more decentralized than in Belgium, which creates both challenges and opportunities for anti-doping efforts. On one hand, the decentralization means that enforcement is inconsistent. Some clubs take doping seriously and implement testing. Others lack resources or will to address the issue. Dopers can migrate to clubs with lax enforcement. On the other hand, decentralization allows for experimentation with different approaches. Some Dutch clubs have implemented peer monitoring systems where fanciers police each other. Others use veterinary advice programs to help fanciers maintain bird health without resorting to performance-enhancing drugs. Dutch veterinarians report that corticosteroid use exists but may be less prevalent than in Belgium. Some attribute this to cultural differences, a somewhat less intense competitive culture, less financial pressure. Others suggest it simply reflects differences in what is reported versus what is hidden. What is clear is that the Dutch pigeon racing community struggles with the same fundamental problem: how to prevent doping in a sport where the incentives favor it and the detection mechanisms are inadequate. Portugal, the growing concern. Portugal has a substantial pigeon racing community, particularly in the northern regions around Porto. Portuguese fanciers have achieved international success, and Portuguese-bred birds have been exported to other countries. Portuguese researchers have been particularly active in developing analytical methods for pigeon doping detection. The studies on LCMS methods for detecting corticosteroids and beta agonists in pigeon feces came from Portuguese universities working with Portuguese pigeon racing authorities. This research emerged from concern about the prevalence of doping in Portuguese pigeon racing. Interviews with Portuguese fanciers conducted anonymously to encourage candor revealed that beta agonists and corticosteroids were widely believed to be in use. Fanciers described these drugs as easily purchased and efficiently improving performance. The Portuguese Pigeon Racing Federation has attempted to implement testing, but faces the same resource constraints as other countries. Testing is limited, detection windows are short, and enforcement is challenging. One Portuguese veterinarian involved in anti-doping efforts described the situation as frustrating. Despite clear evidence that doping is occurring, despite availability of testing methods, and despite regulations prohibiting it, the practice continues because the risk-reward calculation favors dopers. The United Kingdom, tradition meets technology. Pigeon racing in the United Kingdom has deep historical roots. The sport flourished in industrial regions where working-class communities maintained racing pigeons as a hobby and competitive outlet. Mining communities in Wales, textile mill towns in northern England, and industrial cities in Scotland had particularly strong pigeon racing cultures. The Royal Pigeon Racing Association (RPRA) governs the sport in the UK. It has approximately 25,000 members and coordinates hundreds of clubs. The RPRA has implemented drug testing, but on a limited scale. Random testing occurs, and suspicious performances may trigger targeted testing. But the frequency of testing is low, and the detection rates are minimal. British pigeon racing also faces a unique challenge: animal rights activism. Organizations like People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, have targeted pigeon racing, particularly cross-channel races, where birds are released in continental Europe and fly over the English Channel to return home in Britain. PETA claims that mortality rates in these races are unacceptably high. In one documented case, allegedly 90% of birds were lost. The organization has called for bans on such races and for stricter regulation of pigeon racing generally. These animal welfare concerns intersect with doping concerns. If birds are being doped, subjected to drugs that compromise their health, then the welfare issues become even more serious. A bird flying over the English Channel is already facing significant challenges: weather, predators, disorientation. A bird flying over the channel with a compromised immune system, weakened bones, and disrupted physiology faces even greater risks. The RPRA has pushed back against animal rights criticism, arguing that losses in races are exaggerated and that responsible fanciers care deeply about their birds' welfare. But the doping issue undermines this argument. If doping is as prevalent as evidence suggests, then claims of responsible animal care ring hollow. Germany, the silent crisis. German pigeon racing operates through a federal system of regional associations. Germany has a substantial pigeon racing community. Though smaller than Belgium or the Netherlands, information about doping in German pigeon racing is limited. German researchers contributed to early analytical methods for drug detection in pigeons. The 1996 study on detecting boldenone, prednisolone and clenbuterol in pigeon feces was conducted at the University of Munich. But public discussion of doping in German pigeon racing is rare. There are few published reports of testing programs or positive results. This could mean that doping is less prevalent in Germany, that enforcement is more effective, or simply that the issue is not openly discussed. German veterinarians occasionally mention concerns about drug use in racing pigeons in professional publications, but details are sparse. The impression is of a problem that exists but is not openly confronted. Taiwan. The rising powerhouse. Taiwan has emerged as a major force in pigeon racing, with massive growth in the past 2 decades. Taiwanese pigeon racing differs from European models in several ways. First, the scale is extraordinary. Individual races in Taiwan can involve tens of thousands of birds. The logistics are staggering. Coordinating transport, release, timing, and prize distribution for such massive fields requires sophisticated infrastructure. Second, the financial stakes are enormous. Prize pools can reach millions of dollars. Betting on races is legal and extremely popular. The total amount wagered on pigeon races in Taiwan has been estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Third, the competitive intensity is extreme. With so much money at stake and such large fields of competitors, the pressure to gain any possible advantage is immense. Reports from Taiwan suggest that doping is widespread. The regulatory framework is less developed than in Europe. Testing is limited or non-existent in many events. And the combination of high stakes and weak enforcement creates ideal conditions for doping to flourish. Taiwanese buyers have become major players in the international pigeon market, purchasing champion birds and breeding stock from Belgium and other countries. This has created concerns that doping practices are being transferred along with the birds, that the pharmacological knowledge developed in European pigeon racing is now being applied in the less regulated Taiwanese context. China, the sleeping giant. China represents the greatest unknown in pigeon racing. After decades of suppression, when pigeon racing was condemned as a symptom of bourgeois decadence incompatible with communist ideology, the sport has been rehabilitated and has grown explosively. The number of pigeon fanciers in China is estimated in the hundreds of thousands. Major races offer prize money in the millions of yuan. A new industry has developed around pigeon breeding, training facilities, and racing logistics. The regulatory framework in China for pigeon racing is unclear. There appear to be both official organizations sanctioned by sports authorities and informal racing clubs. The extent to which any anti-doping measures exist is unknown. Given the scale of Chinese pigeon racing, the financial incentives involved, and the apparent lack of regulatory oversight, it seems inevitable that doping is occurring, but information is scarce. Language barriers, cultural differences, and the relative opacity of Chinese sports governance make it difficult for outside observers to assess the situation. What is known is that Chinese buyers have joined Taiwanese buyers as major purchasers of European racing pigeons. Auctions in Belgium now routinely include bidders from China, willing to pay premium prices for champion birds and breeding stock. This raises concerns that as Chinese pigeon racing grows, it may replicate the problems of European pigeon racing, including doping, but on a far larger scale and with even less regulatory oversight. Africa and the Middle East. Scattered evidence. Pigeon racing exists in various forms in South Africa, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and other countries in Africa and the Middle East. Information about doping in these contexts is sparse. South Africa has an active pigeon racing community, with federations and organized competitions. The National Horse Racing Authority of Southern Africa Laboratory, which normally tests samples from horse racing, has also analyzed pigeon samples, including the controversial Belgian samples that tested positive in 2013. This suggests that some anti-doping infrastructure exists in South Africa, at least in the form of laboratory capacity, but the extent of testing programs and the prevalence of doping are unclear. In Middle Eastern countries, pigeon racing exists but appears to be less organized and less prominent than in Europe or Asia. Anecdotal reports suggest that some wealthy individuals maintain racing pigeon lofts and compete in informal races, but the scale and structure are different from the federated racing found in Belgium or Taiwan. Australia. The distant reflections. Australian pigeon racing follows largely European traditions, brought by British immigrants. The sport is organized through state-based federations coordinated nationally. Australian fanciers import birds from Europe, particularly Belgium, to enhance their breeding programs. This creates a genetic and cultural connection to European pigeon racing and potentially a connection to European doping practices. Australian veterinarians have written about doping in racing pigeons, including detailed discussions of corticosteroid pharmacology and effects. The Australian Pigeon Company website includes extensive information on doping, presented ostensibly for educational purposes, but detailed enough that it could serve as a guide for anyone seeking to dope their birds. Testing in Australian pigeon racing appears to be limited. Resource constraints and the vast geographic distances involved in Australian racing create logistical challenges for sample collection and analysis. The impression from Australian sources is that doping is acknowledged as an issue, but is not aggressively confronted. The situation resembles that in many other countries. Awareness of the problem, limited enforcement capacity, and continued prevalence of doping despite official prohibition. The global commons problems. Taken together, the global picture of pigeon racing doping resembles a classic tragedy of the commons scenario. Each individual fancier faces a choice: dope or compete clean. If most competitors are clean, then doping provides a huge advantage. If most competitors are doping, then competing clean puts you at a severe disadvantage. The rational individual choice, particularly when the risk of detection is low and the penalties are modest, is to dope. But when everyone makes this choice, the sport as a whole is degraded. Animal welfare suffers. The integrity of competition is compromised. Public trust erodes. Breaking out of this trap requires collective action, strong enforcement, credible testing, meaningful penalties, and cultural change that stigmatizes doping rather than normalizing it. But collective action is difficult when the sport is fragmented across multiple countries with different regulatory systems, different resources, and different levels of commitment to anti-doping efforts. The result is a global pigeon racing community where doping is widely recognized as a problem, where everyone agrees, at least publicly, that it should be eliminated, but where the practical mechanisms to actually eliminate it are inadequate. And so it continues. The forbidden ritual, performed in lofts around the world, before races from Belgium to Taiwan to South Africa to Australia, year after year, season after season. Part 6, Why It's So Hard to Stop. The commitment problem. Truly addressing doping in pigeon racing would require resources that most federations simply don't have and don't want to allocate. Consider what a serious anti-doping program would look like. Frequent testing. Instead of testing a tiny fraction of race participants, you would need to test significant percentages. In a race with 1,000 participants, you might need to test 100 to 200 birds to create meaningful deterrence. Sophisticated analysis. Instead of basic screening tests, you would need comprehensive analytical methods capable of detecting dozens of substances at trace levels. This means LC-MS analysis at accredited laboratories with quality control programs. Longitudinal monitoring. Instead of one-time testing after races, you would need to build databases of baseline values for individual birds, allowing detection of suspicious changes over time. Out-of-competition testing. Instead of only testing race participants, you would need to conduct surprise testing at lofts during training periods to catch drugs used for conditioning, rather than immediate pre-race enhancement. Biological passport programs. Instead of only looking for specific banned substances, you would need to monitor biomarkers that could indicate doping, even when specific drugs are not detected. The cost of such a program would be enormous, tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars per year, possibly more. For federations operating on member fees from hobbyists, this is prohibitive. Even if the money could be found, there's a political question. Would members support it? Higher membership fees to fund anti-doping programs would be unpopular. Many members might prefer to spend resources on other purposes, facility improvements, technology upgrades, promotional activities, and there's a deeper issue. Some members don't want effective anti-doping programs because they themselves are doping or benefit from connections to dopers. This creates a commitment problem. Federations claim to oppose doping. They establish rules prohibiting it, but they don't truly commit the resources necessary to eliminate it. And this lack of commitment is rational given the constraints they face, but it ensures that doping continues. The knowledge asymmetry. Dupers have better information than anti-doping officials. The dupers know exactly what drugs they are using, at what doses, on what schedule. They can conduct informal experiments, trying different substances, varying timing, observing effects. They share information, selectively with trusted associates. Over time, they develop sophisticated knowledge about what works. Anti-doping officials, in contrast, operate with limited information. They don't know which drugs are being used. They don't know optimal detection methods. They don't have access to controlled experimental data. They are trying to solve a scientific problem without being able to conduct the science. This asymmetry means that dupers stay ahead. When detection methods are developed for one substance, dupers switch to another. When testing is announced for certain races, dupers focus on other races. When one administration method becomes risky, dupers find alternative methods. The classic example is the shift from oral corticosteroid administration to eye drops. When testing was first implemented, some dupers were caught because they were giving pills or injectable corticosteroids that left high residue levels. But eye drops absorbed through the tear duct allow for smaller doses that produce effects but leave lower residues that are harder to detect and fall below thresholds. This adaptation is possible because dupers have the freedom to experiment, immediate feedback about what works, and strong motivation to evade detection. Anti-doping officials have none of these advantages. Closing this knowledge gap would require research, controlled studies examining drug effects in pigeons, pharmacokinetic studies establishing detection windows, dose-response studies identifying thresholds. But such research is expensive, time-consuming, and ethically problematic. It requires deliberately administering performance-enhancing drugs to pigeons in experimental settings, which raises animal welfare concerns. Without this research, the knowledge asymmetry persists, and dopers maintain their advantage. The proof problem, even when testing detects drugs, proving that doping occurred in the sense of deliberate administration by the owner for performance enhancement, is surprisingly difficult. Consider the defenses available to a fancier whose bird tests positive. Contamination. My bird must have eaten contaminated feed or drunk contaminated water. I didn't administer anything. Basket contamination. My bird must have ingested regurgitated feed from another bird during transport to the race. I didn't administer anything. Therapeutic use. My bird was sick. I treated it with medication prescribed by a veterinarian. I didn't realize it would still be detectable at race time. Sabotage. A rival must have put something in my bird's feed or water to sabotage me. I didn't administer anything. Laboratory error. The test result is wrong. The laboratory made a mistake or contaminated the sample. All of these defenses have some plausibility. Contamination can occur. Basket cross-contamination does happen. Therapeutic use creates gray areas. Sabotage, while unlikely, is possible. And laboratory errors, while rare in properly operated facilities, do occasionally occur. Definitively ruling out these alternative explanations often requires more evidence than is available. You would need documentation of the drug's source, witnesses to the administration, pattern evidence from multiple tests, or other corroborating information. In many human sports anti-doping programs, strict liability rules apply. The athlete is responsible for any banned substance found in their sample, regardless of how it got there. This shifts the burden to the athlete to prove innocence rather than requiring authorities to prove intentional doping. But in pigeon racing, where the athlete is an animal incapable of purchasing or administering drugs itself, strict liability is harder to justify. Contamination scenarios are more plausible, and the legal framework in many jurisdictions doesn't clearly support strict liability anyway. The result is that even when positive tests occur, enforcement is inconsistent. Some federations impose penalties based on positive tests alone. Others require additional evidence of intent. Still others negotiate settlements that reduce penalties in exchange for avoiding appeals. This inconsistency further undermines deterrence. If the probability of being caught is low, and even if caught, the probability of meaningful punishment is uncertain, the risk-reward calculation continues to favor doping. The cultural normalization. Perhaps the most insidious factor sustaining doping is cultural normalization, the process by which a practice that initially seems wrong gradually comes to be seen as normal, acceptable, or even necessary. This process unfolds in stages. Stage 1, taboo breaking. A few individuals begin doping secretly. They violate established norms but do so covertly, acknowledging that what they're doing is wrong. Stage 2, rationalization. As the practice spreads, participants develop rationalizations. It's not really harming the bird. Everyone else is doing it. I'm just leveling the playing field. It's no different from vitamin supplements or other health products. Stage 3, open secrets. The practice becomes widely known within the community but is not openly discussed. There's an unspoken agreement not to talk about it publicly while tacitly acknowledging its prevalence privately. Stage 4, normalization. The practice becomes so common that it's viewed as standard operating procedure. New entrants to the sport are initiated into the practice by established fanciers. Knowledge about doping techniques is passed down as if it were legitimate expertise. Stage 5, competitive necessity. Finally, the practice becomes so prevalent that those who don't participate feel they can't compete. Clean competitors are at such a disadvantage that abstaining from doping means accepting mediocrity. Pigeon racing in many countries appears to have reached stages 4 or 5 of this progression. Doping is not just occurring, it has become normalized. It's part of the implicit knowledge base that separates successful fanciers from unsuccessful ones. This normalization is reinforced by the structure of the sport. Pigeon racing is not a mass spectator sport. It's a community of practitioners who compete with each other but also socialize, trade birds, share knowledge. This creates tight social networks where information circulates rapidly, but where there's also strong pressure for in-group loyalty. Challenging doping in such a context means challenging community norms, potentially alienating peers, being labeled a troublemaker or whistleblower. The social cost can be high, and the benefits uncertain. Breaking through normalization requires cultural leaders, respected figures within the pigeon racing community, who speak out against doping, who model clean competition, who make it socially unacceptable rather than socially expected. But such leadership has been largely absent. The coordination failure. Even if a majority of fanciers want clean competition, achieving it requires coordination. Everyone has to stop doping together. If some stop while others continue, those who stop are disadvantaged. This is a classic coordination problem, and it's notoriously difficult to solve without external enforcement mechanisms. In theory, federations should provide this coordination. By establishing rules, monitoring compliance, and punishing violations, they create the structure that allows clean competition. But as we've discussed, federation enforcement is weak, and because it's weak, fanciers can't trust that their competitors will comply. Even fanciers who morally oppose doping may feel compelled to do it because they assume others are doing it. This creates a stable but undesirable equilibrium. Widespread doping persists because no one can credibly commit to stopping unless they're confident others will stop too, and no one has that confidence because enforcement is inadequate. Breaking out of this equilibrium requires a coordination mechanism strong enough to establish trust, comprehensive testing that makes it risky to dope, swift punishment of violations that deters cheating, and transparent reporting that assures clean competitors that enforcement is working. Creating such a mechanism requires the political will and resources that have been lacking in pigeon racing governance. The global governance vacuum, the international nature of pigeon racing creates opportunities for regulatory arbitrage and makes coordinated enforcement difficult. The Fédération Colombophile Internationale, FCI, is the international governing body for pigeon racing. It coordinates between national federations and organizes international competitions, but it has no direct regulatory authority. It cannot compel national federations to adopt specific anti-doping measures. It cannot conduct its own testing. It cannot impose penalties. This means that anti-doping standards vary widely across countries. A substance that is tested for in Belgium might not be tested for in Taiwan. A violation that results in a multi-year ban in the UK might result in a slap on the wrist in another country. These differences create opportunities for dopers. They can choose to compete in jurisdictions with lax enforcement. They can register birds under different identities in different countries. They can exploit inconsistencies in rules and procedures. They also create frustration for national federations that are trying to enforce standards. Why invest heavily in anti-doping if competitors can simply race in other countries where standards are lower? Creating effective global governance would require several elements. Harmonized rules across countries defining what substances are banned. Standardized testing methods in accredited laboratory. Mutual recognition of test results and penalties across jurisdictions. Information sharing systems allowing tracking of violations internationally. Coordinated enforcement and sanctioning. Some international sports have achieved this level of coordination. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, provides a framework for human sports. The International Federation of Horse Racing Authorities, IFHA, coordinates equine anti-doping, but creating such a system requires resources, political will, and sustained commitment, all of which have been absent in international pigeon racing governance. Until such coordination emerges, the global governance vacuum will continue to undermine national anti-doping efforts. Part 7. The Path Forward. What would real change look like? Imagine a world where pigeon racing doping was actually eliminated or at least reduced to rare marginal occurrence. What would it take to get there? First, political commitment at the federation level. This means boards and leadership teams that make anti-doping a genuine priority, that allocate substantial resources to it, and that withstand the political pressure from members who oppose aggressive enforcement. Such commitment would need to be sustained over years. Quick fixes don't work when the problem is deeply embedded in sport culture. It requires long-term institutional dedication. Second, adequate funding. Anti-doping programs cost money. The resources need to come from somewhere. Higher membership fees, corporate sponsorships, government grants, or other sources. Members would need to accept that clean sport has a price. And federations would need to be transparent about how anti-doping funds are being used, building trust that resources are being spent effectively. Third, scientific research. The knowledge gaps need to be filled. This means controlled studies examining drug effects in pigeons, pharmacokinetic research establishing detection windows, and biological research identifying biomarkers of doping. Such research would need to be funded, conducted ethically, a challenge when it involves deliberately administering drugs to animals, and made publicly available to inform policy. Fourth, comprehensive testing programs. Frequent testing, sophisticated analytical methods, longitudinal monitoring, out-of-competition testing, and biological passport approaches, all the elements of modern sports anti-doping. This would require substantial investment in laboratory infrastructure, either by building dedicated pigeon testing facilities or by establishing relationships with existing laboratories and adapting their methods. Fifth, meaningful penalties. Violations need to result in consequences, severe enough to deter cheating, multi-year bans, lifetime bans for repeat offenders, forfeiture of prizes and breeding rights, public identification of violators. The penalties need to be consistently applied, No exceptions for big-name fanciers or politically connected individuals. Sixth, cultural change. The normalization of doping needs to be reversed. This requires leadership from respected figures within the pigeon racing community who speak out against doping, educational programs that emphasize clean competition, and social pressure against dopers. Whistleblower protections would help. Fanciers who report suspected doping should be protected from retaliation and possibly rewarded for coming forward. Seventh, international coordination. Harmonized rules, standardized testing, mutual recognition of penalties, and information sharing across national federations. This would require empowering international bodies to set standards and coordinate enforcement, or creating new institutional structures with authority to operate across jurisdictions. Eighth, animal welfare integration. Anti-doping efforts need to be framed not just as protecting fair competition, but as protecting animal welfare. Doping harms birds. Preventing doping protects birds. This framing could broaden support beyond the competitive pigeon racing community to include animal welfare advocates, veterinarians, and the general public. Ninth, transparency and accountability. Testing results should be publicly reported. Statistics on violations should be published. Anti-doping programs should be subject to independent evaluation. This transparency builds trust that enforcement is actually happening and deters violations by making it clear that testing is real and violations will be detected. 10th, technology adoption. Emerging technologies could enhance anti-doping efforts. Better analytical methods, AI-assisted analysis of racing performances to identify suspicious patterns, blockchain-based tracking of bird identities and histories, remote monitoring technologies. Such technologies require investment but could make enforcement more efficient and effective. None of these elements alone would be sufficient. All are necessary, and implementing all of them would require a transformation of how pigeon racing is governed and practiced, a transformation that has not yet occurred and shows little sign of occurring. The moderate reform path. Perhaps comprehensive transformation is unrealistic. An alternative is a more modest reform agenda that acknowledges resource constraints but still makes progress. Such an agenda might include focused testing programs. Rather than trying to test everyone, focus resources on high-value targets. Race winners, birds with suspiciously good performances, lofts with patterns of success. This wouldn't eliminate doping, but it would make it riskier for the most visible competitors and reduce the most egregious cases. Education and deterrence. Programs that educate fanciers about the harms of doping and the risks of being caught, emphasizing that the practice is neither necessary nor acceptable. Voluntary compliance programs. Fanciers who sign commitments to compete clean, who submit to unannounced testing, who participate in educational programs, could receive recognition or other benefits. Collaborative research. Partner with universities to conduct research on pigeon pharmacology, with findings shared publicly to inform both anti-doping efforts and ethical veterinary care. International baseline standards. Even if comprehensive harmonization isn't achievable, establishing minimum baseline standards that all major federations commit to could reduce the worst regulatory gaps. Animal welfare coalitions. Partnering with animal welfare organizations to build broader support for anti-doping and to frame the issue in terms of protecting animals rather than just competition integrity. These moderate reforms wouldn't solve the problem, but they might bend the curve, making doping somewhat less prevalent, somewhat riskier, and somewhat less culturally acceptable. Over time, modest progress might build momentum for more comprehensive change. The pessimistic scenario, it's also possible, perhaps likely, that meaningful reform doesn't happen, that the economic and cultural forces sustaining doping prove too strong, that resource constraints remain binding, that political will never materializes. In this scenario, doping continues at current levels or even increases as the sport grows in countries like China, where regulatory oversight is minimal. The consequences would be several: animal welfare degradation, thousands or tens of thousands of birds subjected to harmful drugs, suffering shortened lifespans, increased disease and premature death, sport integrity erosion, competitions increasingly determined by pharmacology rather than genetics, training and strategy, cynicism among participants and spectators about whether results are legitimate, legal vulnerabilities. As animal welfare laws evolve and enforcement increases, pigeon racing could face legal challenges. If doping is demonstrably prevalent and demonstrably harmful to animals, prosecutors or animal welfare authorities might intervene. Public opinion backlash. If high-profile exposés reveal the extent of doping and its harms, public opinion could turn against pigeon racing. Sponsors might withdraw. Participants might face social stigma. The sport's reputation could be irreparably damaged. Accelerating decline. Combined with other pressures, urbanization reducing available space for lofts, aging demographics as younger people show less interest, competition from other recreational activities, unresolved doping issues could contribute to pigeon racing's decline as an organized sport. This pessimistic scenario isn't inevitable, but absent meaningful reform, it represents a plausible future trajectory. Individual responsibility arises in. While systemic reform is necessary, individual fanciers also bear responsibility for their choices. Every fancier who dopes makes a choice to prioritize winning over animal welfare, a choice to cheat competitors, a choice to perpetuate a harmful practice. That choice can be rationalized in many ways. Everyone does it. My birds aren't really harmed, I have to compete. But ultimately it remains a choice. And every fancier has the alternative choice to compete clean, to refuse to dope regardless of what others are doing, to model ethical behavior even when it comes at competitive cost. Such individual integrity rarely receives public recognition. Clean competitors who place second to dope birds don't win prizes. They don't get celebrated. Their integrity may be invisible, but integrity matters. It matters ethically. It's the right thing to do regardless of whether others are watching. And it matters practically. If enough individuals make the ethical choice, cultural norms shift. The transition from widespread doping to clean sport in any context has always required both systemic reform and individual moral courage. Cyclists who refused to dope even when it meant never winning the Tour de France. Track athletes who competed clean even when rivals were enhanced. The individuals who said no even when it cost them. Pigeon racing needs such individuals. Fanciers who are willing to say publicly, I compete clean, I will not dope my birds, and I call on others to do the same. Such declarations carry risks. Social ostracism, competitive disadvantage, possibly even retaliation. But they also carry power, the power of moral witness, the power to inspire others, the power to shift norms. Systemic change and individual integrity need to work together. Neither alone is sufficient. Both are necessary. A call to conscience. Ultimately, the doping problem in pigeon racing is a moral problem disguised as a technical problem. The technical challenges are real. Detection is difficult. Resources are limited. Enforcement is challenging. But these challenges are solvable if there's will to solve them. The deeper issue is moral. Do we care enough about these birds to stop harming them? Do we value fair competition enough to enforce rules? Do we have the integrity to say no even when cheating is easy and profitable? These are questions that every participant in pigeon racing must answer for themselves. For federation leaders, the question is, will you commit the resources and political capital necessary to actually address doping, even if it's unpopular, even if it's expensive, even if it reveals uncomfortable truths about how prevalent the problem is? For veterinarians, the question is, will you speak out about the harms you see, educate fanciers about the consequences of doping, and refuse to provide drugs for performance enhancement rather than legitimate medical treatment? For researchers, the question is, will you conduct the studies necessary to fill knowledge gaps, even when the research is difficult and funding is limited? For journalists and media, the question is, will you investigate and report on doping honestly, even if it damages the sport's reputation? And for every individual fancier, the question is, what kind of competitor do you want to be? What values do you want to embody? What example do you want to set? The answers to these questions will determine whether pigeon racing evolves toward clean sport or continues down the path of normalized doping, with all its consequences for animal welfare and competitive integrity. Conclusion: the bird in the balance. In lofts across the world, racing pigeons wait. They are descendants of birds that carried messages across battlefields, that navigated home from hundreds of kilometers away, that formed partnerships with humans spanning millennia. They possess extraordinary abilities: magnetic sense that detects the Earth's field, cognitive maps of vast territories, endurance that allows non-stop flight for hours, homing instinct that compels their return. These abilities are marvels of evolution, products of both natural selection and careful human breeding over generations. And yet, in the service of human competition, these abilities are deemed insufficient. The bird must be enhanced. Its physiology must be manipulated. Its natural limits must be overridden. A few drops in the eye, a pill in the feed, an injection in the breast muscle. Simple acts performed in seconds that alter the bird's biochemistry, its immune function, its skeletal structure, its lifespan. The bird cannot consent to this. It cannot understand what is being done to it. It experiences the pharmacological effects, the reduced pain, the increased energy, the mood elevation, without any awareness that its body is being damaged. It flies because it is compelled to fly, by instinct, by training, by the chemical manipulation of its nervous system. And when it lands, exhausted, disoriented, its owner collects the prize. This is the forbidden ritual. This is the open secret. This is what happens before the race. It happens in Belgium, where pigeon racing has century-deep roots. It happens in Taiwan, where millions of dollars are wagered on races. It happens in Australia, the UK, Portugal, the Netherlands, Germany, China, South Africa. It happens wherever racing pigeons fly, wherever humans compete for prizes and prestige, using birds that cannot protect themselves from the consequences of that competition. The practice persists because it is profitable, because detection is difficult, because enforcement is weak, because it has been normalized within the culture of the sport, because individual rational choice leads to collective harm. But persistence doesn't mean inevitability. Cultures can change, norms can shift, sports can reform. Cycling was once notorious for doping. Baseball was tainted by steroids. Olympic sports face systematic doping scandals. In each case, exposure, public pressure, institutional reform, and individual moral courage eventually produce change. Not perfect change. Doping still occurs, but meaningful progress toward cleaner competition. Pigeon racing can follow a similar trajectory, but only if there's will to do so. Only if the people involved, fanciers, veterinarians, federation officials, researchers, journalists, animal welfare advocates, decide that the current situation is unacceptable and commit to changing it. The bird cannot make this choice. The bird in the loft, waiting for Saturday's race, has no agency in this matter. It will fly as it is trained to fly. It will endure what it is subjected to endure. It will suffer or thrive based on decisions made by others. We make those decisions. We choose whether to manipulate these animals for competitive advantage. We choose whether to subject them to drugs that compromise their health. We choose whether to build a sport on a foundation of systematic chemical enhancement or whether to rebuild it on a foundation of fair competition and genuine respect for these remarkable creatures. The bird hangs in the balance, literally and figuratively. Its fate depends on human choices. Its welfare depends on human integrity. Its future depends on whether we care enough to protect it from ourselves. What will we choose? The answer is being written now in lofts and laboratories, in federation meetings and veterinary clinics, in decisions made by individual fanciers about how they will compete, in conversations within the pigeon racing community about what kind of sport this should be. The forbidden ritual continues, but it doesn't have to. The bird waits. What happens next is up to us.